Hello, welcome to today's webinar, Assessment Matters, Dispelling the Myths of Nonprofit Complacency. I'm Ellie Buteau, Vice President for Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and I'll be serving as the host today. I'm joined by my Center for Effective Philanthropy colleague, Andrea Brock, who's a manager on the research team here. Andrea is also the lead author of the research report that we'll be discussing during this webinar. Dan Cardinale, President of Communities in Schools, is also here with us. Communities in Schools is a national nonprofit organization that works to prevent students from dropping out of high school. And if you visit the website of Communities in Schools, you will see how seriously the organization takes performance assessment and management. Their website is full of information about whether and how they're in fact helping students in the ways that they intend. Also on the line is Faye Twerski. Faye is Senior Fellow and the Acting Director of the Effective Philanthropy Group at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And Faye has extensive experience working on the issue of performance assessment, both from the nonprofit side and from the foundation side. We'll begin today's webinar with a brief overview of CEP and a research initiative we've undertaken called the Grantee Voice. The research paper we'll be discussing today, Room for Improvement, is a part of that initiative. My colleague Andrea will then share a bit about the methodology behind the research, and she'll share the findings from that report. After sharing highlights from the research, we'll hear some analysis and insights from Dan and Faye based on their expertise and their varied experiences. And then we'll close with plenty of time for questions. You can submit questions throughout the webinar through the question pane that appears on your computer screen. We'll maybe try to get to some of the questions as the webinar progresses, and we'll certainly try to get through as many as we can after we hear from all the panelists. So I want to briefly share some information about the Center for Effective Philanthropy as background for why we did this piece of research. CEP is 11 years old, and our mission is to provide data that will lead to insight so funders can better define effectiveness, assess their effectiveness, and improve their effectiveness. Our main audience is foundations, and we hope that as a result of either reading and using our research, engaging with our tools, or engaging with our communications and programming, that foundations will ultimately be able to have more impact through the work they do. All of our research is grant funded, and many of our major funders, shown on this slide, provide operating support that fuels our research efforts. So our biggest area of research to date has been in the area of funder-grantee relationships. And to further our work in this area, we started a new project earlier this year called the Grantee Voice Feedback for Foundations. And what is the Grantee Voice? It's a panel of 300 nonprofit leaders from across the country who agreed to share their experiences working with foundations through responding to a series of short surveys. In the past, all of the research that we've published about foundation-grantee relationships has been based on grantee data that we've collected through an assessment tool that we offer to individual foundations called the Grantee Perception Report. In contrast to that, this panel, the Grantee Voice, is an effort for us to gather information about grantees' experiences broadly rather than about their work with an individual foundation. So we created this panel to be able to collect more timely data from grantees, and our goal is to help foundations better understand how they can work most effectively with nonprofits and therefore be more successful themselves. The first survey we administered to the Grantee Voice panel was in April of this year, and the topic was nonprofit performance measurement and management. And we selected this topic because in order for foundations to understand the difference they might be making through their work, they need to have some understanding of how their grantees are doing. In previous research that we've done, we've learned a few things about frustrations that foundations have when it comes to nonprofit performance assessment. In 2011, we learned through our research that foundation CEOs believe nonprofits are not being held to high enough standards of evidence to demonstrate the difference they're making. And earlier in 2009, we learned that when it comes to foundations trying to understand how effective they're being, a frustration that program staff tend to have is the inability of their grantees to assess their own performance. So that's some of what we know from the foundation side, but what do nonprofits have to say about this issue? What's the grantee perspective? Our research questions for this project were, how important do nonprofits believe it is to demonstrate the difference they're making? And how much help are foundations offering to nonprofits to assess performance? And I'll turn it over to my colleague Andrea to share what we learned.
Great. Thanks, Ellie. And so first I just want to share a little bit about the methodology behind this research. And so Ellie, as you said, earlier this year, we sent a survey on nonprofit performance assessment to the Grantee Voice panel that you just introduced. 177 of the 300 panel members ended up responding to that survey for a response rate of 59%. In terms of the nonprofit organizations that the respondents represent, as you can see, the median staff size is 10 full-time equivalents. The typical organization has $1.1 million in annual expenses. The median age of the organization is 28 years. And a typical nonprofit has 20% of its revenue coming from foundation grants. Ellie, you also just shared the questions we sought out to answer with this research. And so what did we find? What are our answers to those questions? So first, we found that nonprofits very much want to be able to understand their performance, and they're trying to do so. Second, nonprofits want more help in performance assessment efforts from their foundation funders than they're currently receiving. And so let me explore these findings a little bit further. Performance measurement matters to nonprofits. 81% of the respondents to this study believe nonprofits overall should demonstrate the effectiveness of their work by using performance measures. Most are governed by a board that has made understanding the organization's progress a top priority. And furthermore, 80% report using data to inform their efforts to improve on an ongoing basis. Not only does performance measurement matter to the nonprofits in the study, but our data shows that they place a high priority on assessing their performance. Our survey also found that foundation funders' role in helping nonprofits assess their performance is somewhat lacking. Nonprofits want more help from their funders than they're currently receiving. Few respondents, only 32%, say their funders have been helpful to their ability to assess their organization's progress. More than 60% report wanting more help from their funders in these efforts. So why are funders not being helpful to nonprofits in assessing their progress? Part of the answer could be that the majority of respondents, 71%, have funders that do not provide any support for assessment efforts. This includes financial and non-monetary support. Provide more funding was the #1 requested step nonprofits said foundation funders could take to be more helpful to their assessment efforts. But it isn't all about the money. We also found that nonprofits are having little discussion with their foundation funders on average on topics related to performance assessments. These topics include the results of performance assessments, what performance targets nonprofits should set, what data to collect, how to interpret the collected data, and how to develop the skills of staff to collect and interpret the data. More than half of the nonprofits want to talk more about these topics. And there appears to be a great need to discuss how to develop the skills of nonprofit staff to collect and interpret data related to performance assessment, given that 71% reported wanting more discussion about this topic with their foundation funders, as this chart shows. Another part of the reality about how nonprofits and funders are working together in these efforts is that there is a perception among the nonprofits in the study that funders are primarily interested in information about nonprofit performance that will be useful to them rather than information that has utility for the nonprofit. As this chart shows, 53% of nonprofits believe their funders prioritize their own needs over the needs of the nonprofits. And so this is the last data point I'm going to share from our research. However, at CEP, we believe that this data has some important practical steps funders could take that I want to share now. First, there is an opportunity for funders to break from the pack and provide support. Again, 71% of the nonprofits in this study are not receiving any support from any of their funders in assessment efforts. And this isn't just financial support, which again was widely requested, but it's also non-monetary support. Foundation funders should have more discussions with nonprofits about assessing their performance and discuss not just the end results of performance assessment, but also the upfront pieces. So what data to collect, and does the nonprofit staff have the necessary skills to carry out this work? And lastly, foundation funders should strike a better balance when they request the nonprofit collect information related to their performance that takes into account not only their needs as a funder, but also the needs of the nonprofit as well. And I'll end there and turn it back over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Andrea. I'd like to let everyone on the line know that the slides from this webinar in the recording will be sent to everyone who registered for the webinar in the next couple of days. So you'll have access to the information that Andrea shared, and it's all also in the report Room for Improvement. Andrea, one question that I have here for you, you had shown a chart that indicated 29% of nonprofits said that they're receiving support, either monetary support or non-monetary support, from funders to do assessment work. Can you tell us what's the proportion of nonprofits that said they're receiving monetary support? Is it that full 29% or less than 29%?
Right, so you're right, Ellie. So 71% said that they have funders that do not provide any support, and 29% have funders that do provide support for their assessment efforts. Of that 29%, 19% reported receiving financial support for their assessment efforts.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to turn now to hear from Dan and Faye, and Dan, we'll start with you. You've dedicated a lot of time and effort at communities and schools to performance assessment and management. Can you share with us some of your insights and what you've learned over time based on your experience?
Sure. Just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here. I have a couple of points and then hope there's a dialogue and some questions. The first is, I think, just it's an obvious point, but I think often I, in my past when I've gotten into trouble, have forgotten it, and that there is a real asymmetrical relationship between a grantee and a funder. There is money involved, and often there is a kind of power that goes with that. I don't think that that is at all a deal breaker or a problem. I just think it has to be acknowledged and managed on both sides. So the first thing I think around this notion of performance assessment, and particularly around evidence or evaluation, is a fair degree of transparency on both sides, but particularly on the foundation side, for a clarity about what constitutes evidence in terms of their decision-making regarding an investment or a grant that they would make, and then clarity up front about what, in fact, they expect to be tracked. And those two things don't align all the time, and they can be very misleading in the grant-making process and lead to lots of confusion. Second thing I think that's important to think about is that foundations often have a portfolio of grantees, but my experience is they tend to have just one engagement strategy. And grantees can be at very different degrees of organizational development, particularly around performance assessment. So it really is incumbent on a foundation to have a strategy that clearly assesses where a nonprofit or one of their grantees is, and provide the kind of training and technical assistance and investment to help them move along a continuum. Because they may have set their whole portfolio up against a set of metrics that some or only a partial majority of their grantees can actually deliver on. And it sets up a very unfortunate dynamic. And then the final thing I think I would say around this asymmetry that would be important is something that I have found to be enormously helpful. And that the foundations we've historically worked with tend to be extraordinarily smart in the area in which they work. They have folks that have monitored the sector, they know the research, and they tend to know who the good players are, probably much more than I do. And so two things I think to pay attention to there. The first is that they can easily, if they're not careful in their aggressive learning, which I think is an important resource to the sector, convert their grantees into tutors on a particular area. And so can wear down the resources and time in a way that isn't necessarily commensurate with the investment that they're making. So a sense of you're going to pay for the kind of learning that you want to engage in above and beyond your grant. So I've had program officers say, I'd love to sit down with you for a couple of hours and talk about this, or could we talk to your team about something that's related to another grantee? And those are real material costs that often aren't recovered. What I have found is that there are some great examples where foundations have really become a resource around performance assessment. And one example I want to hold out is the Wallace Foundation, with whom we have a relationship, and they are an investor in CIS, has created these learning communities. And they have a evaluation and performance assessment subgroup within a larger frame of a learning agenda. So what it means is that they can pull together the experts, even when there is a variation of organizational development within the grantee pool, and kind of create a self-directed learning agenda that then they resource. So they get to learn in the process, but they facilitate the real material learning for grantees. And then the other thing that I have found to be enormously helpful, and it really is the onus on the nonprofit community, is we have to be aggressive about searching out relationships in foundations and demanding that they spend the time with us to answer our questions and to figure this out. So just because they aren't giving it doesn't mean we can't ask or demand it. So I've had terrific historic relationships with folks like Jim Shelton at Gates or Nicole Gallant when she was at Atlantic, Kelly Fitzsimmons at Ed McConnell Clark, and in the corporate community, Carolyn Berkowitz at Capital One. Then finally, I'd like to say something about really a kind of a call to action for foundations to pay attention to. We on the nonprofit side increasingly realize we have to have evidence in terms of evaluation and ongoing performance assessment in order to land and continue a productive relationship with our funders. We do observe more than episodically, and certainly not routinely, that the evidence and performance assessment often can be trumped by stakeholders through the board or political issues. That presents an enormously challenging environment because what it does is it tells you that the performance assessment is what some of the folks have, the rules folks have to play by, but there are other rules, and you can avoid the hard work of building your own capacity around assessment and using that data by playing, an artful political game, which has been kind of the way business has been done historically. So I'll close with the following kind of notion. What I have found in my experience with communities and schools is that when we were in a turnaround mode and when we were in an innovation mode, it was easy to bring on funders and investors, and because we were in an innovation cycle, we tended to have alignment around performance metrics and the evaluation. We're now in a phase of the unsexy scaling strategy, and it is a much more difficult conversation with funders to ensure that they come to us usually with a particular agenda and clarity about what they want to get accomplished, and that we become a petri dish for them, and the discipline around aligning their particular performance metrics and ours is often the most important negotiation well beyond the budget negotiations. And so I always say it is sexy and kind of like dating when you're in the innovation cycle, but it is really about the relationship when you're in the infrastructure and the building cycle. Both up there. Look forward to people's questions.
Thank you, Dan. A couple of questions here for you. In the slides that Andrea presented, she shared a statistic. It was that 71% of nonprofits want more discussion with funders about how funders can help nonprofits build the capacity of staff to collect and analyze performance data. How has communities and schools gone about developing its internal capacity to do performance measurement and management work? Your website is full of information that you've collected about your work. Is that work done internally, or are you bringing people from external to that?
So primarily it's self-prompted. So really about 15 years ago we began the process of committing ourselves to performance assessment and evaluation to guide our work. And those dollars originally were primarily driven out of our own board and unrestricted dollars. So they were commitment on the organization's part to fund its own kind of muscle building around this capacity. Once we got some strength, core strength as it were, we then were able to attract investments from folks like Atlantic Philanthropies, the Knight Foundation, who saw the value of driving our evidentiary base to the next level. And since then, there have been foundations, both in terms of human capital and financial investment, that have been quite aligned with helping us build our muscle. But the initial process, probably when you needed it the most, actually had to come out of our own creativity of getting unrestricted dollars.
Okay. And a second question here for you, Dan. How does communities and schools use the performance information it collects to help the organization make changes or improvements in the way it works?
So I run our national office, and so we have a network of 200 nonprofits. So we use it a particular way. I do want to call out on the phone, I think Eric Metcalf is on the webinar. I hope he is. He runs the program work for Austin, CIS of Austin, which uses performance data in a remarkable way, quite different than we do. What CIS does is we routinely collect data on our network. So we have one massive data dump at the beginning of the year, and then we have a unified database across our entire network. And so we are routinely pooling that data, mining it against two things. One, our training and technical assistance strategy, and then we're like a community foundation. We invest $8 to $9 million a year. And we use that data to drive capacity building change in our network. So then we monitor it over the course of the year through regular program reports from our investments on the grantee side, but through data collection and looking at student improvement or in terms of organizational capacity for our local affiliates. So we have a data system. We have a team of folks that dedicate themselves to kind of working this thing through. And then we use the data actually to make decisions.
Thank you, Dan. And Faye, you've worked on both sides of the table. You've worked with nonprofits that are trying to assess themselves, and you've worked with funders trying to assess themselves and their grantees. What are your thoughts on this research and or insights based on your experience?
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks to the Center for Effective Philanthropy for inviting me to be here. And I want to endorse all of Dan's really good points, and I think he offers just a great example of really great work. So I'll try not to repeat what Dan said and make a few other remarks, and then really open it up to questions and comments from the group that you've assembled. For every conversation that happens around measurement of any sort, I would say that the most important thing is to lead with purpose. One of the findings that is in the research is that grantees say that there is insufficient discussion happening between nonprofits and funders. And when those conversations do happen, in my experience, all too often they start with metrics rather than purpose. And I think if you start off with purpose, you'll get a lot further and do a lot better. And I'm happy to come back to that. A second point is to clarify language. One of the things, we know this about the sector, that there's so much jargon in the sector. People use terms and mean different things. And what was interesting to me about the survey, and I think it's really important work and highlights some really important issues, is that in the blog posts on CEP's blog after some of the initial findings were posted, people wrote about performance assessment as though it was the same thing often as performance measurement, performance assessment, evidence, evaluation, monitoring. It felt to me a little bit conflated. And in preparing for this, and they're all distinct. In preparing for this webinar, I did my own little informal survey, and I talked with colleagues around the sector in some very different places and asked them their understanding of these different terms without saying that there was one right way or wrong way. And what I found was that there were as many different points of view on what the terms meant as there were terms. And so I do think clarifying language, what do we mean by performance assessment, I think is going to be quite important in order to advance our practice in performance assessment or performance measurement. I would say performance measurement, and by that I mean the kind of measurement that nonprofit organizations do to track their performance and see how well they're doing against goals should be part of funder due diligence processes. If it's important to funders, they should look at it up front. One of the things that the Hewlett Foundation does, we do a lot of general operating support grants, and part of our diligence process is to look at how do grantees operate? Do they measure their work? How do they do it? Are they an organization that seeks to continually learn and improve? It's part of our diligence process. Measurement isn't cost neutral. If donors are asking for data, they should pay for it. Either like the Hewlett Foundation does, which I endorse in terms of providing general operating support for foundations whose work we support, or if a funder is going to be giving a program or project support, add a line in there for performance measurement. It's definitely not cost neutral. It costs time and money. Measurement is hard to do well. It's not just focus that it needs. It also requires skill and attention. There are not a lot of tried and true and efficient tools out there. There are some, and I wanted to mention just a couple, but there are more. Perform Well, which I saw they did a post on this as well. Elizabeth Boris did from Urban Institute. Perform Well is an emerging performance measurement and management tool that can be used in field-specific ways across a number of different fields in the sector, where organizations can use tested tools to measure progress in given areas and track their progress in a systematic way and compare their progress to established benchmarks. It's an interesting, relatively new tool, but emerging as a potentially efficient way to measure progress and use that data to inform decisions. Quad, another different kind of tool, newer still, is a promising performance measurement tool in the advocacy space, and a number of funders are supporting this tool to measure performance across a number of different areas and fields where nonprofits are advocating for change. You know, one of the things that was interesting to me in these set of findings is that nonprofits are looking to funders to help them in these areas. And having been on the funder side of the table for the last 7 years, I would just say that funders aren't that good at this either. So it's not like funders have the answer, and if they only revealed it, everything would be copacetic. Funders are really trying to figure this out too. I think because of what Dan was talking about earlier in terms of the power imbalance, we have to keep that in mind. But in terms of the funders are in the same sector, trying different things, experimenting, but it definitely, I don't think, cracked the code on this either. In my experience, especially before joining the funder side of the table, I observed that measurement isn't always a top priority for nonprofits. And sometimes the data collection and reporting is more ceremonial than deep and constructive and useful. And I think, often nonprofits think of programmatic work as more of a priority. And I think it is a priority, but if the measurement is important, then I think that nonprofits should be budgeting for this like they budget for rent. As they think about where is their organization going to be operating, they also think about measurement from the beginning, that they start measuring from the beginning of their work. They start small, build in an agile way. You often get the best and least expensive measurement when you start from the beginning. One of the pieces of advice I always used to give to my nonprofit clients when I was in the consulting world is that nonprofits should always try to get ahead of their funders on the measurement question. If nonprofits get ahead of their funders, think this through, and are clear about what it is they want to measure, what's important and why, then most of the time funders will follow the nonprofits when the nonprofits have thought out their measurement priorities. It's when they haven't, in my experience, that funders are more likely to ask for less than relevant data and more burdensome reporting requirements. That's not always true, but it's a general rule that I've seen out there. And finally, I would end in sort of echoing what Dan was saying earlier, that use is key. You have to use the data. Take time to think about what it is you're seeing, both nonprofits and funders. Everything will become more useful and clearer the more that you begin to talk about what it is you're finding, what it is you're learning, applying those learnings in practice, and applying it to improving your measurement over time. I'll end in the spirit of the debates we've all been sort of sitting through with two calls to action, one for funders and one for nonprofits, and it's sort of a quick 4-point plan. So with respect to funders, I would say the 4 things that I would suggest for funders is to ask your grantees what's important to measure from their perspective and why. And to the extent possible, trust your grantee, clarify the purpose of the measurement and intentions for using and sharing the data, and fund them to do it, to measure what's going to be useful to them. Second is fund measurement. Make sure that you're funding it either through a GOS or through a specific line item. 3, talk about results and their implications. Really important. 4, remember that improvement is often a more constructive frame than punishment. Call to action for nonprofits, a 4-point plan for those nonprofits on the call. Think critically about what you need to know. Be efficient and seek out emerging tools. Customize them for your needs when necessary. Start small, budget for this. 3, talk about results and their implications. 4, remember the work you're doing is hard. Stay curious.
Great, thank you, Faye. Faye, two questions here for you. One question from someone on the line, could you repeat the 2 tools that you described, and could you also spell the names of each of those tools?
Sure. The first is a site that folks can go to called PerformWell. Perform, P-E-R-F-O-R-M-W-E-L-L, performwell.org. And the second is Quad, like in the middle of the college, Q-U-A-D. And there is, it's really new. There is no site for it, but it's funded by a group of funders, Solidago, Rockefeller Brothers, Chorus, the Unitarian Universalist Beach Program, and Hewlett will be soon joining as a funder as well. And if folks wanted to learn more about Quad, I'm going to point you to one of the funders, Sarah Christensen at solidago.org. That's solidago.org.
Great. And another question, Faye, could you repeat or say again your 4th point for nonprofits?
Stay curious. And I can elaborate on that because, I mean, I think all of us, I mean, that's just sort of almost a human point, isn't it? I mean, that sometimes we all can become committed to certain beliefs and ways of doing things. And I think it's just important in this work that we do in the social sector. It's really hard to just stay curious and to keep an open mind and learn. And data, you know, represents part of that equation, but a bigger part, I would say, is just an open mind and an open heart to learning and improving.
Great. Faye, you mentioned that funders aren't necessarily very good at sometimes helping nonprofits with performance assessment. So from your perspective, what is the role of foundations in this work?
Well, I mean, I would say that the most important thing is to fund it. I mean, I think one of the cardinal sins here is when funders ask for data and they don't recognize that that there's a cost to it. And so I do think making sure that if we're asking for data that we're funding it, the collection, the analysis, the use of it. I think this probably isn't as big of a problem universally, but I think sometimes funders, well, here's what I'll say is we shouldn't pose as funders as knowing more than we do. I actually think Dan was very generous in his representation of funders having a bird's eye view and knowing a lot from the 3,000 feet, that making connections and understanding what's going on in the field, who the good players are. And I think that's probably true, but there's also a way that grantees know a lot more in some respects. And as funders, we really need to honor all that the grantees know about what's true on the ground. I think funders also shouldn't impose irrelevant measures. And I don't think that any of the funders do that out of malice, but I think it happens more often than it should, partly because it's the downside of so much strategic philanthropy. Even though I've been one of the biggest proponents of strategic philanthropy, one of the downsides is that funders themselves have measures to track our own performance, and sometimes those are not as relevant to all of our grantees. And when we impose irrelevant data collection, that causes problems. On the positive side, I think supporting skilled intermediaries to work with nonprofits to help grantees in their measurement efforts is a really positive thing to do because funders aren't always themselves program officers in a position to provide that support, but there are skilled intermediaries and talent out there that can.
Okay. Faye, thank you. Faye, I think that you're breaking up a little bit when you move away from the phone, just as an FYI for those on the line.
Okay.
Dan, did you have a response you want to share?
I just wanted to thank Faye, first of all. I thought the points you made were spot on my own experience. And I wanted to just throw out, I'm curious what her thoughts are on this, and then other people respond through the portal. Sometimes I think that this conversation regarding performance assessment is seen as data collection. And one of the things I think we pride ourselves on in having to, it's a hard thing to remember, and that is that our own personal experience is a form of data, is a form of important information, particularly around implementation. So there are great ideas which are impractical to implement, and then I think practitioners can bring an incredibly important element to test and refine theory, but also kind of in aggregated, you can learn a lot. We've, over the years, I think, gotten better about listening to our own network. And there's a discipline in doing that I think we've toggled over the years. Sometimes we're better at it than others. But I'm curious, Faye, in your experience, I know your own background is one where there's a lot of attention paid to both the recipients of services, as it were, and also the implementers. And I'm curious about how performance assessment or experience factor in as credible to this conversation in terms of providing evidence to foundations.
Well, there were a lot of questions in there, so let me see if I can begin to address them. Dan, I think the quick answer is really important, I would say. Can you hear me, or am I breaking up?
We can hear you well.
Okay, I'll try to speak more directly. I think experience is really important, and I think I used to have a little formula that I would use about data plus experience plus openness to change is what leads to change. That you really need all of those ingredients. Experience on the ground, can validate, can contradict, can call into question the data, and vice versa. And you need both. You need data, you need intuition. All of those things play in. And the other thing is that data don't make decisions, people do. We have to be open and consider the implications of data. it's not a straight line between data and decisions. We want to have data-informed decisions, but there's a lot of consideration that happens in between that's filtered through our own experience and set of values.
Yep. The thing I would add in our experience at communities and schools, and certainly my personal experience when I have really dropped the ball, is not accounting for, to your point about people, motivations and values that drive people in this work. I think one of, it's not, you know, it's not a pervasive truth, although it's certainly been my experience that many, many folks in the nonprofit sector are motivated in part by the expression of their own values of creating change or providing service or whatever it may be. And that is both a huge resource, but also can be a significant obstacle, and it has to be accounted for. Particularly, I love your formula, and I think I would lump that in the experience side of stuff, of really being able to mine what people are, why people are doing what they're doing, and how it influences the way they think about their experience and look at the data, I think is critical.
I think that's really right, Dan. I think that's true both domestically, where I know you're focused, but also internationally. And there are some colleagues, I think, who are on the line who I worked with when I was in Jerusalem a couple of years ago working there, and I got to see firsthand how important it is to factor in culture and values into the everyday work. And there's so much philanthropy, important philanthropy, that's happening overseas, that accounting for the culture and the values of all of those different communities where we're trying to have an impact is just really critical. And I think that we need to do a whole lot more work in that area than we do currently.
Faye, a couple of requests. Could you repeat the formula that you shared, the formula that you like to use?
Sure. And sorry if I'm breaking up again. Data plus experience plus openness to change.
Thank you. A question here for both Faye and Dan. When we at CEP shared this research, we heard from a number of foundation folks that they were surprised by the percent of nonprofits saying that they are doing assessment work and using that information to help them improve. Some foundation folks told us they thought those percents were too high given what their experience has been working with nonprofits. So given your experience, Faye, and given your experience, Dan, what do you think might explain some of the disconnect between what foundations feel nonprofits are not doing and what nonprofits say that they are doing?
So I can share a little experience in two different ways. The first is, as I mentioned, I have the privilege of running our national office, which is a network. We're part of a network of 200 affiliates. I mentioned Eric Medcalf, who's on the line. We have a bunch of our actually affiliates on the line. And we, with 200 affiliates, I think we're a good subsample of a set of organizations committed to performance metrics and using performance assessment, and yet within our own network, as evidence-based as I think we are from an external point of view, network or nationally, there's great variation within our network. And I would locate the variation for two fundamental reasons. The first is financial resources. Half of our affiliates and many nonprofits in America are small operations. And so the executive director may be doing 5 or 6 really big jobs, including performance assessment and evaluation. And there's only so much time and bandwidth and expertise any one person who is managing a wide range of things, including fundraising and board development and program design and the finances. So I think it's a human capital issue as well. So financially, to have the resources and the tools, I think Faye gave some great tools, but also at some level, we're just under-resourced. And the final thing I'll say around the human capital piece is, as it goes to the values question, I think most folks, in my experience, have come into the nonprofit sector not to be, kind of associated with the notions that traditional business have, which are performance metrics and assessment. They're in it for a kind of a human component to it. And I find often this resistance, which I just think we have to battle against, that using performance metric is somehow inhumane. It's reducing people to numbers or to statistics, and I think there's an important conversation we as leaders in the nonprofit sector, and I think also in the foundation community, need to have around this set of issues and just kind of dispel that myth.
Faye?
I think the question that you ask or convey, Ellie, about the disconnect is a great object lesson in a way about how data need interpretation. And because, what is it that we actually mean when we see a number? X% say this. So just to make that observation, I think that this is really a question, in addition to what I thought Dan's point was really good, I think it's really a matter of degrees. It's a little bit like eating healthy. My sense of eating healthy may be different from my 11-year-old son's sense of eating healthy. And yet we both eat. And he might say on a good day that he's eating healthy. So, I think that is to say all nonprofits collect data of varying types, of varying amounts, of varying quality, with varying purpose. But what nonprofits measure may not always match funder expectations. They may not always match the literature. And so they're definitely measuring, and they probably want to use that data better. But in terms of, does it align with expectations of funders? Possibly not, and probably not, especially if there hasn't been any discussion of purpose.
Thank you, Faye. Andrea, a couple of questions here for you. One is it CEP's belief that funders are equipped to support nonprofits to do performance measurement and performance management work? What is your sense of?
Yes. Ellie, I would say, I guess there's two points I would make on that question. First, I would say that it's not CEP's belief necessarily. I think what we would hope is that foundation funders would take our research findings and reflect on their own goals or strategies or really the ultimate impact they want to have. And if there is a funder who does care about specifically how nonprofits are assessing their performance or progress, that they will listen to the findings and really think clearly about how they're supporting those efforts. And I think my second point, related to that question, and again going off of what Dan and Faye have been saying, is that there's several ways that funders can support nonprofits in these efforts, and it really came through in a lot of the comments that the respondents gave to us. And so just going back to our finding about how nonprofits want to have more discussion with their funders on these issues, I want to make that clear that a lot of the comments was stressing that those conversations are two-way conversations. So not necessarily just coming from the funder, but also giving room for the nonprofit to share and exchange ideas with their program officer or their funder. And so I think there are some little steps that came out of our study, even something as simple as asking the nonprofit what information they're already collecting, knowing that many nonprofits have several funders that are sending requests to the nonprofit for performance information.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrea. Methodological question, Andrea, about the study. Was there any response bias from panel members that did and did not respond to this survey? Any response bias you're aware of?
Yes. And so we did look at whether there was a bias in the 177 panel members that responded to the survey versus the remaining panel members of the 300 that didn't respond. And we did not find any bias in terms of differences in staff size, issue area of the nonprofits, and so whether they were in health or arts or environments. But we did find one small difference in terms of the annual expenses, and we found nonprofits that had the smallest expenses were more likely to respond to the survey than the nonprofits of the highest expense quartile.
That would make sense.
And you mentioned, Andrea, that was a small difference?
Yes, it is small.
Okay. Faye, a question for you. Can you give an example of a funder and a grantee having a discussion about the purpose of performance assessment? Faye, are you there?
Well, yeah, I am. I was just repeating the question to myself out loud, thinking, can I give an example of that? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'll try to answer it, which is, any time that a program officer is engaging with a potential grantee, that's an opportunity to have a very constructive and maybe even generative conversation about performance measurement. That is, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What are you going to be tracking to see if you are making progress against your goals? How often will you be tracking that? How do you expect to use the information? Will you be willing to share the information with us? What happens when, if you find out that you're not making the progress that you expected? Will you be willing to share that with us? And for the grantee to be able to ask the funder, what is it that you're interested in having us track? Does our measurement plan meet your needs? If we measure what's important to us, is that sufficient for you? And for the funder, the program officer, to be able to say yes, or mostly, or how would you feel about adding one more indicator, or we're looking across a cluster of grantees who are doing X or Y, and would you be willing to do some common measurement and come together as a learning community so that we can all learn together and improve our efforts in this or that area? I'm not sure. That's an example of kinds of conversations that a funder and a grantee could have. Not everyone needs to be scripted that way.
This is Dan. I just want to say I think you just outlined a phenomenally good process. And I can just say in my own experience that the variation, there's an institutional variation from one foundation to another. And then within a foundation, there is a tremendous variation from program officer to program officer. So there's a kind of a hard and soft skill set around a kind of negotiation that I think is critical. And so paying attention, I think, to, from a management perspective on both sides, on the nonprofit side, being able to diagnose kind of what you're walking into and quickly figuring out what kind of relationship you're going to have, as well as kind of the management on the foundation side of kind of really training for these skill sets of disciplines. So let me give a concrete example. We've had a number of terrific relationships with foundations, and where it starts up where we get this terrific alignment on what we hope to be collecting that's mission focused for us and aligns with the grant. And then over time, we get a series of questions or a follow-up set of meetings that pull us further and further away, that send us back doing more investigation. And it really, what we've determined, a lot of that has to do with is the wonderful curiosity of program officers to expand their own learning. But in doing so, it's somewhat of a, pushes on being a somewhat, abusive of, I think, the nature of the relationship. So I love your frame, because I think that it's good on both sides of the table as a mechanism.
Thanks, Dan. And another person has asked us to ask you, Faye, is there a model that exists that you might recommend for funders and grantees having discussions about performance assessment, either an example that you could share publicly or an article or a case that you could share for people to look into or to read about?
That is such a good question, and I should know the answer to that, and I don't. I'm sure that there is, or I hope there is. And maybe on the GrantCraft site there is something like that. But I'll look for it, and I'll talk with colleagues at the Hewlett Foundation who know more about these things than I do, even, and maybe we can get a resource, point to a resource for you for sharing. If not, maybe someone should create one. But can I go back to one of the comments that Dan just made? Is that all right?
Yes.
Because I think that point is so important, and it's so common, the experience, especially in large foundations, where your program officer shifts or priorities shift, and then the conversation about measurement that you felt so good about when you began, all of a sudden, the vagaries of that foundation begin to affect, all the things in your own organization. And I think that the main way that can be fixed from the funder side is really leadership. I mean, I think that's where leadership at the funder makes just a huge difference. The tone that the leader sets on down in terms of how do you work with grantees and treat grantees, what should the nature of our behavior be, how do you both challenge and support, I think is really key. So, we've been talking a lot about program officers, but program officers, take their cues from the leaders of the organization.
Thank you, Faye. With that, Faye, we're going to conclude the webinar, and just as a preview of some of our upcoming research, I'd like to share that we recently fielded our second survey from the Grantee Voice Initiative. The topic of the second survey was transparency. So what does foundation transparency mean to nonprofits? How transparent do they find their funders to be, and why does that matter to nonprofits' ability to work effectively? So we're about to start analyzing that data, and we'll have a paper coming out in a couple of months from the second survey. If you would like to contact us about any of our research, our information is on the slide on your screen. As Faye mentioned, feel free to visit CEP's blog. We've got a number of people writing guest blog posts about the topic of nonprofit assessment in recent weeks, including a blog post from Dan Cardinale himself. Faye, if you want to email us any examples that you might have of conversations happening between foundations and grantees about measurement, we can certainly share those with the group. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar to everybody who registered in the coming days. So thank you to Dan, thank you Faye, thank you Andrea, and everyone on the line for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.